Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Saima Saleji, and I welcome you on behalf of the BIRA's event team. Today's in our session is part of the Race and Education Report series, which will start with Dr. Melissa Jogi's a brief introduction, followed by Melissa's presentation focusing on higher education institutions' outlook on race and equality. Next, Dr. Richard Grace will respond to Melissa's research project, followed by an approximately 10 minutes Q&A session. You can post your questions and comments in the chat box during the presentation, which we aim to take during the last 10 minutes or so. So starting with Dr. Melissa's Jogi's introduction, Melissa is a senior lecturer at the University of Roehampton and the institution's research culture lead. She is also director of the Diversifying Leadership Program at Advance HE. Melissa's research focuses on education for social well-being, which proposes a meta-theory of social activism, overarching health education, critical race theory, social welfare, and post-colonial pedagogy. Her theoretical insights have led to recent British Academy and UKRI funding awards between 2019 and 2021, multiple small grants focusing on oral care for young children using gardening techniques between 2021-2022, and knowledge exchange projects funded by BIG South London 2021 and the Cathedrals Group 2020. Welcome, Melissa, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for that introduction, and a very pleasant good afternoon to everyone. And thank you for taking the time to be here. I'd also like to thank Richard for taking his time to do the moderation for this event. So without further ado, I will get started. And let me just share the screen. Apologies, another PowerPoint, but hopefully you should be able to see that there now. All right, thank you, everyone. So first and foremost, just very good habit to thank BIRA for this opportunity to conduct this body of work. The small funding grant scheme has really provided a wonderful opportunity for scholars to look at exploring race and race-related issues from a variety of different perspectives. So this I thought today I'd just give you, in addition to the report, instead of going over all of the details, which you can read for yourself, I thought I'd just pull out some of the um, more discursive points that emerged. And within the report, at the point in which it was being written up for submission, not much focus was given on some of the key critical issues that were covered in the focus groups. So I thought today might be a good opportunity to share one or two of those with you as well, and then just engage in some further discussion. So hopefully that should make me keep to time. So why this topic now? And as you would know, my work here focuses largely on looking at the Race Equality Charter that's been around and been developed. I'd say just about a decade ago, it started with trialing out what do we need to do when we recognize now, or acknowledge is maybe the better word, that there is systemic racism in higher education institutions. And how do we start to address this? So Advance HE has put together the Race Equality Charter. Many of you who are from institutions would be aware of bodies of work being done to create these action plans. And it's become somewhat of a charter that, you know, if anything, it's inspired many institutions to start thinking about race and other protected characteristics that form that equality, diversity, and inclusion consortium of issues that we need to be thinking about when we are thinking of developing our staff, thinking of developing our organizational structure, our students. What is the sort of direction that we want to head in moving forward? So currently there are 96 institutional members. So you have to be a member of Advance HE first and foremost, but not every single higher education institution is. And of those 96, 23 currently have bronze awards. Now, the Race Equality Charter, you can either get bronze or silver. There is no gold standard. And this is why my project focuses on, let's imagine if we could get to a gold standard, what might that look like? So I found that many institutions seem to be grappling and wrestling with the need to try and comply with silver standards and bronze standards. And I feel like some of the creativity has been lost in us really thinking about what this ultimate goal might be. So, in order to assess this, the project really dives into that first structural level of what have we been doing, why now have we been doing this? What's driving the motivations behind the changes we're making? How are we policy borrowing from each other? Is it healthy? Is it effective? What's been working? Why are some people not choosing to comply with this? So it was really trying to take a snapshot of a flavor of what's happening across the nation, and inviting these institutions to participate through different modes. So the action plans, and this is what we call them, action plans that each institution needs to write. And maybe many of you watching this talk have been part and parcel of providing and creating these action plans. But it's really looking at the resources of what your institution has to commit to developing training, developing mentorship, whatever you want to call your activity under your action plan. Um, and also looking at that in conjunction with the culture of your institution. What are your needs? Where do you want to go? And finding a bit of a pathway strategically that will align with the institution's broader strategy. So the action plans are the real guts of the Race Equality Charter. It puts forward a commitment on paper about the way that you want to proceed with addressing racism within the institution. So it's a good direction. And I would say healthy, because you know what? We finally have something, a charter that has a presence that will make people have these conversations, a trigger, if you want to call it. Um, but how far do we need to get to go to gold? And I must say, having done the project, this is something that there's still a lot more thought to put into. And I've got as far as being typical academic and provoking more questions, which will hopefully provoke more conversation around what this gold standard needs to be like. But I found it very odd that, we are we're sort of on a journey, but we don't really know what that destination might look like, or if we have any institution in the UK that can hold that at that level. And maybe that might be for more obvious reasons than others. So, one of the first things to start to think about is that some institutions agreed to be going for the Race Equality Charter, whereas others who are members are not there yet, maybe because they are working on their applications. But there are many institutions who are not members of Advance HE who are not committed to the Race Equality Charter. And this raised some questions as well. And it was reflected in our process of recruiting participants for the study. Those institutions that were not part of Advance HE or not in the Race Equality Charter um, were very difficult to recruit. Now, are they doing their own action plans and addressing racism within their institutions separately? I would have to say most definitely, maybe they are, but not being part of the consortium raises a few questions as well. Why not? Uh, did they see this as not an opportunity to kind of get a consolidation on where we want to go? Why do your own thing? So there was a lot of issues around thinking through the rationale for institutions to be part of something or not part of something. Some of them may be very institutionally rich and can try their own interventions if they so please and don't want to comply. All of these are potential reasons. So to look at this topic, I did, these are my methods that I use. So I did some topic modeling. I looked across a range of um, reports that, looked at addressing race, and civil report and a whole series of reports and policy actions, and also combed through as many of the action plans that were available, which are available on Advance HE's website. When you go through the institutions, many of them have made them transparent so you can see what their commitments are, just to try and pick up some of the patterns of what is the general direction that we're moving in. So that formed the basis of a bit of the questions that were asked later on and getting to the guts of the issues that seem to be looked over. And this was race in relation to other protected characteristics. And this inspired the questions for the survey, which focused largely on trying to problematize intersectionality when we had race and other characteristics involved, um, asking individuals who work in the EDI forum or who are interested in race to actually comment on the survey from both the viewpoint of how they think their senior leadership would reply, and then some of the questions asked them, given this particular scenario, how would you reply, or what would you choose to do? So this kind of burden of making a choice with both hats on proved to be quite interesting in some of the survey results regarding intersectionality. You can see where some of the personal biases came out, and you can see where the uncertainty, uh, which raised a really interesting question for me, that many people who construct the EDI plans and work at the grassroots levels were not quite certain. They knew the outcome they wanted to get, but did not know the climbing steps to get there. And that made me wonder, are we doing our re-education of the issues in the right way? Are we just talking about the concepts that get plugged on the wall, but not necessarily navigating how do we step on the right scaffold in order to get to where we want to go? Do people know how to move through strategically getting from A to B? And maybe we need to do some more work on that instead of some of the interventions that are currently run. And the focus groups was an opportunity to invite the members, people who were on race equality, who had the accreditation, people who had applied and were not there yet, and of course the organizations that have nothing to do with Advance HE or are not part of the Race Equality Charter, and have a conversation with them about some of these problem scenarios as well. And I'll share a little bit more on what some of those issues were. So the structural challenges, the big things that came out, no surprise to you, so I don't need to dwell on them, but how they trickle into each other is interesting. Everyone, without a shadow of a doubt, said that if race is not prioritized at senior leadership level, it will not get the time of day in the sun to even have a chance of being able to do something about issues that are happening within the institution. And this trickles into thinking about the educational or the interventions related to race that we try to roll out to develop awareness. This is a major issue as well across the nation. We have several institution interventions that we run, but we are not quite sure what works for whom, when, and why. Um, so, is it fair to say that you can look at your staff composition and your student body composition and see that an institution is running an intervention and then say, we're going to do that too? And I think the mentorship scheme falls heavily a victim of this design. We think mentorship programs are the way to raise educational awareness and to help promote professional capacity building and to raise visibility, all of these really key words. But if you're trying to run a mentorship scheme where you have, you know, 60% of your staff are just purely ECRs, your mentorship scheme is not going to work. You're going to have your one or two Black professors who are going to be super burdened with the need. And then we're falling back into our bad habits of again putting the burden of race onto some people and not everyone equally, or having more scope and capacity for raising intersectional issues alongside race. So these interventions are tricky when we just broadly choose one or two. And then the visibility, there is this continuum of, senior leadership saying that they want these particular changes and all the right words ring the right bells, but then the continuum of the people who have to do the work, who are the non-academic professional staff or the professional staff or the ECRs, who don't get the visibility for the work that they're doing. It's almost like you're cutting off the head, the face of the work and the traction that needs to take place from the body, from the seats of power that sit within the institution. So, how do we get a healthier flow in that continuum going? And those words come in there: transparency, communication. And that seems to be an Achilles heel for many higher education institutions, that lack of transparency and communication. Where is the strategy that we are all working towards? Where is the end point? Can someone make that clear? So, in the survey, some of the findings and the inferences that were made here was that obviously sexuality, race, disability, major interventions, likewise across health and across the business sector in the UK, have largely focused on issues of race and on gender. In higher education institutions, we found that sexuality, race, disability was something that was being pushed a bit more aggressively, followed by gender and then religion. But we do have a kind of crowding out of protected characteristics, which is what made the intersectional challenges a bit like stop and think for a minute. Ooh, are we taking our opportunities and just pigeonholing down one particular stream because we've it's the way that the culture of the sector is moving? Is that necessarily what we should be doing, or are we going to suffer as a result of pushing interventions or cause hidden harms that we are later going to have to address? Should we be thinking about that beforehand? Discrimination was largely expressed by people just through, I'd say, an HR point of view of structurally thinking of leadership, gender pay gaps, workload allocation, bullying, harassment in the workplace. And you found that while this was something that was clearly looked at, it was difficult to anticipate how people were thinking of potentially putting something in place to stop this from happening, or putting something in place that was not metric loaded. And I think that was another issue: understanding the metrics that the institution was telling you about your gender pay gap. What did that really convert to when it was you and another colleague? And can we get more transparency of explanation around that? And then this was another big thing: the mindset shifts versus the institutional buy in. So, if we push to do things like decolonize, how much of our programmatic pushing is going to be helping with that mindset shift? And how is the relationship between both the change that we're pushing for um, going to be cemented into, oh, this is happening now, and this is the new habit, this is what we do? Whereas in some cases we have that it seems on paper that we are pushing for those changes, but we're not getting people actually coming out and saying whether it's working, it's not working. So where is the buy-in, and what comes first, and what's the cost of that? This is a sample of one of the questions from the intersectionality, where I put the burden of choice, and this is something that we've done at Roehampton. We've put a lot of emphasis on gender unisex toilets. However, our student body is largely made up of Black minority ethnic Somali students who come from an Islamic background. So, unisex toilets, you still find that while it's good to support our trans and transitioning students, we also have to consider how this may be potentially perceived by female Muslims as being an unsafe counter belief to their religious background. So again, making the choice here, when really pushed on what would you do, what has senior leadership done? It was easier to say this is what they've done for many of the participants. But then when asked what would you do, people were a lot more hesitant about saying, oh, I'm not quite sure. They went back to their own personal biases and beliefs. And if they had experience with trans friends, they were likely to choose maybe an alternative option. The aims of the focus group were really to push on to people to ask them what would they do to tackle racial disparities themselves. Um, what decisions do they depend? What data do they depend on to make those particular choices? And what pathways of equality? What type of equality they think they need to get to? And how would they make choices around that as well? So it really pushed them to do some thought experiments, and some of the examples of that were asking, like with the football right now, many of you may have seen this with Idrissa Gear, who's a Muslim footballer but won't wear, he'll take the knee but won't wear the rainbow colors. And the conversations around that were that this is almost a game now, playing off one protected characteristic over another and putting the burden of choice on public figures to make those mistakes. Why are people being held accountable to present themselves in a particular way? Now, it when you really sit down to strip this down to look at how people look at role models, or how you would look at supporting people to be their best selves or be their selves, feel like they belong. If we bring that back into an institution, it's not an easy pathway at all, um, to understand where do you push and pull. We also found, and this was quite striking, that when it came to looking at what your resources are when you spend money on EDI, how much is your institution spending on race? What is your budget for EDI? What percentage of it? Where is it going? When asked that question, many people couldn't answer. And I asked them in a ratio, is it 30%, 60% of the whole institutional budget? Count the salaries, make a guess. It was very difficult for them to give a guesstimation. Then, when asked, how much do you want to make these changes? That was also very difficult to say, because in many ways, the best answer was that the EDI needed to be invested in everything that we do. So how do we regulate for that? How do we monitor for that? How do we put a budget in place to make sure that that is happening? It certainly disrupts the thinking that if EDI needs to be in everything that I do, then it's not in everything that I do. You suddenly start to realize there are certain decisions made on how forms are constructed, or how modules are set up, or how timetabling is set, that excludes the decision of that EDI being within that composition. It sits in some extra committee. So we say we want money to fix things, but we need to think very carefully that it's not just money we want to fix things. We want the money to be structurally attached to the things that are not even yet broken. We want it to be structurally attached to everything so that we can keep it in mind. And that may be one of the more healthier ways to address race. Don't wait until it's broken. We have many things broken, but try and forward plan to be aware of it's a potential risk that we may cause some disruption. What are we putting in place to address that? And focus group inference is very aware of the time, so I'm going to speed through this now. Again, the money point on where are we putting the money, the continuum of the change of the leadership versus the individual members of staff, who's getting the visibility for doing what, and is that channel open or not? And the uncomfortable conversations about race, which needs to be not just a one-off seminar or something we do in Black History Month. It has to be continuous, and it has to come from a point of accepting that you don't know everything about everybody. And while that sounds very naive to say, you always have to have an inkling of uncertainty that I don't know and I need to know. And I think that is something senior leadership needs to be trained a bit more about. So making decisions that are not quite clear, and being brave about saying that this has not worked. Can we make it work better? We need to come back to the table and share the accountability to try again. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. Those are my details. Please do get in touch, and I will pass over to Saima.
Thank you very much, Melissa. What a thought-provoking presentation. And I'm swiftly moving to Dr. Richard Race, and I'm going to introduce him very quickly and then his response to it. So Dr. Richard Race is currently a visiting professor in education at Sapienza University in Rome, Italy. He had previously spent 16 years as senior lecturer in education studies at Roehampton University in London. He is editor of many books. Some of them are Multicultural Dialogues and Multicultural Education, which is currently in production with the Open University Press and is due to be published in 2023. Moreover, he's author of Multiculturalism and Education, of which the third edition is contracted with Open University Press. Furthermore, he is also editor of Advancing Dialogues in Multicultural Education. His current research projects are toxicity in higher education and the politics of Welsh and English curriculum policy and their application to education practices. And we are all looking forward to see these books very soon in print. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Saima. Thank you to Melissa for her report and important contribution to educational research. And also thank you to BERA. I've been on BERA Council and I've seen the evolution of their race and equality policy. And this report is part of that policy. So it's great to see the policy bearing fruit over a number of years. I think having read the report, the major issue for me is race, racism, and racial equality in higher education. It's visibility and invisibility within the sector. The challenge I think that Melissa raises for us all is the gold standard. What is it? How do you get it? And I think we need to move beyond the envisioning. Melissa talks about, imagining it, but what is it actually? And I think that's an important question for all of us to reflect on today, because I think we need to move from silver and bronze, and even those that pay but don't have the awards, to that utopian golden standard. But I'll come back to that at the end of my 3 points. But Melissa's methodology is interesting here. I've just touched upon that with the REC award holders, those that are not received, not subscribed, and the award holders themselves. They're interesting categories. And I'm sure that they sort of shape institutional policy in relation not only to the award holders, but what they actually do with the award. And I think Melissa has set out coherently the issues that are around those issues that universities have to face. I think one of the big themes that comes out of Melissa's report is the top-down approach. And it strikes me that if the Vice-Chancellor isn't supportive of the award is in trouble. But it goes right through the institution, the Vice-Chancellor, senior management, school leadership and management. That's a really important level for me. Staff, but also students, as Melissa has raised as well. So it's that top right down to the bottom. And perhaps I've just written here, Melissa, that students are perhaps very influential in the development not only of the charter, but what an institution does with the charter. But I think as you raise, there's a practical issue here. It's not just with staff from top to bottom, but it's also with students and their commitment to full-time education, where is the time for them to actually engage in how a charter evolves, be it bronze or silver, or hopefully in the future, gold. I enjoyed the scenarios. I think they were very educational. I thought there was a trick scenario there when you talked about Eid, Ramadan and Black History Month, Melissa, because of course, staff should have said, oi, hold on a minute. If Black History Month in the UK is in February, and in the USA it's in February, and in the UK it's in October, Ramadan and Eid are not held during those months. So interestingly, staff should have come forward and said, look, let's get it factually correct, because why are we celebrating Ramadan during a time when it's not actually in existence? And I was talking about this 2 days ago with a colleague. Ramadan next year is between Wednesday the 22nd of March to Friday the 21st of April, with Eid to follow. So in that sense, I'm wondering how many staff actually know those dates from this year if you're not Muslim, and next year. Because of course, we need to teach these to our students. You talked about the Somalian population of students, considerable number of them in the student populations, both undergraduate and postgraduate at Roehampton. And we need as staff to know those dates. I mean, I'm criticized for this. Dates and celebrations. Richard, why are you still teaching these when they are 50, 60, 70 years out of date? Well, I'm teaching them not only to students, but to staff as well, because the majority of our students will not know these dates. They will not know Chinese New Year. They will not know Diwali. They will not know the dates for 2023 for Ramadan and Eid. So in that sense, this is the general knowledge rather than the more detailed knowledge that we need to know about as staff so that we can actually teach our students. But if staff don't know this information, where do we reside, on those issues? Another important theme involved the EDIs and continuing professional development, not only to those, but to staff as well. And that ties in with the last point. The general issue of staff training, which for me is virtual, sanitized, cheap, and impersonal, or it has become that over the years. I'm sure a lot of colleagues here in higher education have sat there in front of a screen doing 20 questions because it's compulsory. You've got to get over 80%. You can print out a certificate if you're that way inclined, and you move on. But there's no opportunities to talk to anybody about some issues, some important issues that are raised during those training packages. There's also the issue of internal and external training that Melissa raises in the report as well. And again, I think Melissa has mentioned it here, and I would speculate that internal training costs are higher than external training costs, because we're talking about time commitments and budgets, as Melissa has raised here. I think there's a need to invest in both. And this is the institutional commitment to subjects like this. Mel not only uses critical race theory here, but intersectionality, and it is not just about race and racism if you use that intersectional lens. Melissa talks about gender, religion, disability, sexuality, as well as race. And I think this all has a part to play in wider continuing professional development. So, and there's one more question before I get to the final 3 points. And that was, Mel, the mention of the BME, BAME staff working or support groups. And I think they in themselves are interesting, because I think they raise the issue of why are they needed in institutions? Why are colleagues, white, black, mixed race, Asian, however you define yourselves, why are people coming together in working groups and support groups to promote issues that need to be taught, need to be known, let alone taught in the classroom? So my 3 points to open up the discussion for a longer question and answer session, colleagues, is the first one: the Advanced Higher Education Race Equality Charter has to be supported by everybody in an institution, from the Vice Chancellor through senior management, through school leadership and school management. Melissa talks about line managers and how important a part they can play in this process. Staff, but as Melissa talked about in her presentation, and I've scribbled madly down here, Melissa, students. So it is the true top-down, bottom-up approach, where everybody is working with each other within the institution. But I think that's only part of it, and I'll come back to that in my final point. Before that final point, CPD and staff training, institutional training, intersectional training, which again involves a combination of internal and external training. However, again, if we're being practical here, we have those issues of time, institutional commitment, and budgets. Mel talked about that issue of money and how much money, time, and investment is an individual institution. It's not just Roehampton, Glasgow, UCL, wherever. It's every institution. Those not involved in the 96. If you think that there are 125, 130 universities in the UK, where are the other 35 that aren't even involved at the moment in this process? The final point, not surprisingly, is about the gold standard, and I'll sort of end where I started. Relating to the first 2 points that I've mentioned, but again, if Melissa is challenging us to think about how do we even begin to imagine, let alone think, let alone produce a gold standard, do we need something like a centre of race equality and anti-racist pedagogy? Not just a centre within a school, but within an institution, whereby all schools and faculties sign up within the institution, within the university, to the charter. Not just within a school of education. Say an institution has 10 schools or faculties, all 10 have to sign up to it. And perhaps if they do, then the institution has a better chance of getting the gold standard. It should not just come through an education school. It's got to be institutional and universal. I would imagine that would be a requirement for silver status anyway. But I wonder. And I don't have, of course, I don't have the facts in front of me there. I also think that the wider community needs to be involved if we're going to have a gold standard. And again, that's the contest between research and teaching. That's within a school of education, but I'm not only talking about a school of education, I'm talking about all faculties within an institution, and also a community commitment. And for education, that would be schools, but we're also talking about NGOs, we're talking about other organizations that are outside of the institution, but within its radar, so to speak, both local, national, and international. If it's going to be gold standard, it's got to be total. It's got to involve all partners. If we're talking about REF, TEF, every abbreviation you can think of that institutions are signed up to, whether we like them or not, is irrelevant. I think it's got to be an institutional criteria that involves everyone and everything. If it's going to be, if the institution is going to take it seriously, and if this gold standard is going to be produced, it's got to recognize wider society and culture if we're going to get that gold standard of race equality. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. And like Richard, I really like the idea of intersectionality, because we are not only focusing on gender, or we're not only focusing on ethnicity, but it's much wider that we need to think of. Now, any questions? It's been very quiet. The chat room is very quiet, but you can raise your hand using the reaction button right at the top. Yes, Richard.
I'll ask a question if there are no questions. Oh, we got Jill.
There's
Oh
one
no, they can't.
from.
Simon, they're there. There's Jill. There's Christine. Go ahead.
So let's start with Jill. If you can unmute yourself, please. Hiya.
Hi. Hi, thanks, Melissa, and thank you, Richard. Really interesting. I started to type, but I thought it would take me too long. So my question is, earlier this year, I think it was earlier this year, Michelle Donlan, who was then university's minister, I don't know if she still is, so many changes in that department, she said that universities should not participate in the Advanced HE Race Equality Charter. And she said various other things. And that's in line with the stance that this Conservative government, whoever happens to be the Prime Minister, has taken to try and close down any discussions on race and racism, and certainly any efforts to challenge racism in their institutions. And I just wondered if what impact that might have had on the willingness of universities to engage with this.
Thanks, Jill. That's a wonderful question, and nice to see you again. Um, so you're correct. Around the 30th of June this year, vice chancellors across all institutions received this letter, and it's provoking culture wars in the sense that the real gist of it was that by formalizing the Race Equality Charter and putting these actions that were going to be attentive to race was going to make white colleagues uncomfortable with the complying of um, or losing their democratic voice, losing their voice to be able to say, I don't agree, I feel like I am forced to do X, Y, Z. So that's just some context for people who maybe weren't fully aware of this letter. So vice chancellors had to make a stand on how they were going to respond to it. I think it has caused some issues in the sense that it costs, and bureaucratic issues, it costs money to be part of Advanced HE in your membership. However, we do believe in the spirit of if you're going to do something, maybe we will have better practices and transparency if we do it collectively. We can learn from each other rather than operating in isolation where we may be at greater risks of putting things in place that may further marginalize certain groups of people. I think it has given some institutions who did not or do not have the capacity or the resources to invest in the charter, an out to not do so right now. Just for the sense of, oh, well, maybe we need to go back and put the spotlight on Advance HE and what they're trying to achieve. And it became a bit of a scapegoat opportunity rather than consolidating with the group. Some institutions who are already part of it and invested in it have stuck with it. And that is maybe also a political decision, because Advance HE is essentially the watchdog for higher education organizations. So it goes way beyond just the Race Equality Charter into the Athena Swan, into the training of vice chancellors, into leadership development, all of the other programs, including my own with DL. So if you are going to take a stand, you pick your battles. And I think it posed much more of a political option there than the actual investment in doing race better.
Thank you. Thank you.
Christine?
Thank you, Melissa. I don't know if this is a question or comment or what, but it's just my thinking. And I was interested that Jill kind of situated the discussion in the contemporary kind of issues. And I wrote a note to myself about the historical situatedness of the work itself, because obviously work around race equality precedes Advance HE, and actually was in response to race equality, the Race Relations Amendment Act. And I was thinking very much about institutional ignorance and institutional inertia in the era of race equality. And I was thinking about Gus John's 2003 seminal piece, where he reviewed all of the race equality action plans of HEFC funded universities in the country. And his analysis was actually quite shocking, because the bare fact is that universities weren't really engaging in it because they're not interested. Okay, simply, they're not interested. So there's a question in my mind about Advanced HE being a way for universities just to credentialize themselves. It's another thing that they can stamp on their page to say, yes, we are a member, we've got this charter mark, we've got that charter mark. But actually, things aren't changing. The EHRC 2019 report tells us things aren't changing. The work that Andrew Pilkington has done tells us things aren't changing. So I do question how we could kind of look forward until we kind of look back. Why are universities all of a sudden going to shift their thinking? So that was just my piece.
That's a really good point, Christine, because and I think I mentioned it a little bit in the talk about the continuum. So it's absolutely a rubber stamp opportunity for senior leadership to say, box tick, we've done it. And this falls into the intersectional theory too with Kimberly Crenshaw's work, right? With the Black woman and Black women neither being represented by groups who were Black or by women, in the sense that you can just get washed out of the system. And I think this mindset shift versus it's always going to be trailing behind and must fall into the culture of the institution, which means that even when senior leadership are part of ticking that box, are they still investing in making sure that what they have said they're going to do, they are doing and being held accountable for it? This is where the metrics gets problematic as well, because some of the interventions we don't even know if they work. And I think it's a problem of a horse and a carriage kind of situation, because we know kind of where we want to go, but making those stepping points, it's not necessarily getting us to that goal that we want to see achieved. And how we assess it, how we structure it, is all part and parcel of that agenda. So it's a very hard question to know, what do we do next in terms of I would say it would be really good to put some long-term studies into the evolution of a particular organization and maybe compare higher education institutions to other organizations like Westminster City Council, where I was so impressed with some of the work that they were doing around race, around women who had miscarriages, around having working groups for more than just um, the basic thing, but listening to the people within their organization and responding to that accordingly. So maybe it is something that just higher education needs to put a light on, and we can learn from other organizations as well. Richard.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just a very quick injection here. I think this is political, and if things are going to change, if we're going to meet that gold standard, I think it's got to come from government, and quite clearly a change in government, which at some stage is going to happen in the future. You know, you think of Kimi Badenoch and what she said recently about, you know, her race and racism, and despite the fact that we have some of the most culturally diverse cabinets in history, their politics um, doesn't permit them to talk about race and ethnicity issues, in my eyes. So in that sense, you have that contradiction. But politically, if the government does change, there has been talk about the possibility of changes to the race and equality um, legislation of 2010 with a new government. And in that sense, if we can make this charter compulsory within higher education, and we have to lobby politically, if that is, you know, if that even has a chance of coming to fruition, if we can move from 96 to 128, then I think universities will have to invest in more time and more effort, and this report and future longitudinal studies, Melissa, for it to occur. Because I think that's the opportunity. If we can lobby for not only this to be compulsory in all institutions, but also for a gold standard, which I think more universities will sign up for, instead of, again, I did mention your categories of award holders not received, and the most interesting one, not subscribed, which says a lot, doesn't it?
And I think, you know, to touch on the points really well raised by Christine and Jill as well, and you too, Richard, we really need to be careful that what I saw in some of the action plans was an opportunity to burden people with needing to work on race, and these other characteristics. And we need to be careful that the change is not going to happen if we make it into a burden, a workload burden, you know, it's just not the right approach. And I worry about that because it's like passing the buck. It's Ramadan. Who's going to do this for everybody else? Oh, somebody needs to do it. This person has a hijab. Give it to them. It's just the wrong kind of marketing for the wrong kind of image. And I do worry about forcing these actions in a way that is not giving people the reflective space to understand what have I learned, and how is this going to inform my practice, what might I do better next time, because there's always an opportunity to do something better the next time. I feel like that gets squeezed, and I feel like that's where, coming back to Christine's point, where the change might actually be internalized. So absolutely right to lobby for it politically if we need to get them to get the buy-in, but we need to build a system that has mechanisms to allow for that understanding to flourish and breathe.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And you know, Richard was also talking about pedagogy. So I think we need a pedagogy for success, which includes race, which includes ethnicity, which includes the ideas of intersectionality. Now, each and every teacher or the tutor in the classroom, they need to work towards it. Again, they shouldn't be taking it as a burden, but rather an opportunity to learn and to progress in the area, which is very much needed and at the moment. So thank you very much. Any other questions? Richard again. There you go, Richard.
Go on. You mentioned pedagogy, Simon, and I think decolonising was mentioned in the report and by Melissa in her presentation today. I think this ties in with issues such as teaching race, racism, structural racism, institutional racism, and having the confidence to do this. It's the same with decolonising. It's colonising, decolonising, post-colonising. You've got to have members of staff that know what they're talking about and how they can teach it, so that you move from a culture of burdening to one of increased understandings. And this is where the intersectional lens, I think, comes back into play as well, in the sense that, again, I did mention the the Equalities Act legislation, which brings in the other categories, which is an intersectional document. And I think that that needs revision and updating with a new government. And I'm hoping that perhaps if these issues are lobbied within that package, you're not hiding them away. You're actually bringing that intersectional lens to the political agenda. And I think that would encourage rather than deter vice chancellors from bringing this on board. I mean, despite the fact that our colleagues, are on strike within higher education today, I believe that, if you think of vice chancellors' salaries, institutions are cash rich. They've got the money for this. And if 96 institutions, Melissa, have signed up to the charter, there's also a job that's being advertised at the moment that is focused on an application for the Race Equality Charter. So again, it is out there. Quite clearly, it's being discussed within institutions, and I'm hoping that this project will encourage. It's the dialogue, isn't it? It's the terminology. It's what terms we actually use when we talk to vice chancellors, or if our vice chancellors read this report and the publications around this as well, that we have to encourage vice chancellors to engage even more and make it an institutional commitment, rather than again, Christine talked about Andrew Pilkington's work about Macpherson and what happened after the Macpherson report into more cultural diversity in schools, and how universities took that on, but within 5 years it had all gone, with the same government, ironically. But thankfully, a hand has gone up, and I will hand back over.
Jill.
Yes, and just to say, we're just thinking from what people have already said. I wondered how you were going to use this report actually to perhaps further generate discussion about these issues, and will you be sending it to universities and the Vice Chancellor's office, for instance, and trying to provoke some kind of reaction, some kind of response, some kind of discussion of it?
That's a really good point, Jill. And to be honest, aside from putting it in a publication, I've not put too much thought into um, the public engagement side of what I could potentially do with it. And I think if there is support, maybe through BERA and through Advance HE, I might be able to disseminate it a bit broadly into some of their avenues and publications as well, and hopefully that will trickle through. But that's a really good point. And I think there is a lot of richness in the data that was collected, albeit it was a small sample, but potentially even upscaling it a little bit further and trying to get support to get more institutions to participate if we were to run a second round, and maybe even do something that could get that longevity. So we check them year 1, year 2, year 3, and just see how they are advancing. Maybe that would also help complement how the Race Equality Charter keeps track of its progression. So those are the things that I might be thinking of next, in terms of taking it forward once if it's been well received.
Thank you.
Thank you. And any advice, please do let me know.
Quickly going to Diane.
Hi everyone. Actually, my question is a nice finishing off question. I was going to ask Melissa, what's your prognosis for institutions actually wanting to take this forward and seeing it as important? You made the really good point that it has to come from the top, otherwise it's unseen and it's lost and everything like that. So are you hopeful, or do you see it as an ongoing journey? Well, obviously it is an ongoing journey, but are you hopeful of actual achievements?
That's a really nice one, Diane, and thanks for that. I must say, reflecting that sometimes we feel the burden of senior leadership as being very oppressive. But I have, in my time, very short time, seen one or two people who are real powerhouses of advocating and pushing back. And I think they can't do it forever. And they can't be the one who always has to be the crutch to do so. But if you want to push back, I've seen people do it. I think if we empower everyone just a little bit more to be able to say that we can, we might get some things done. We mightn't get everything done, but we might get some things done so other people can step forward and do a little bit more. I live in the hope that research culture is now a massive intervention being funded by Research England. 28 million has gone into it this year. And I'm hoping that through the work of research culture, the interventions that are being run and the investment that's being put into it will also help support those agendas. And I think it's very young in its stage of development. I'm part of it, so I hope to be one of those little voices that can push for that direction as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. And there is Kevin has put something in the chat box, which looks very interesting. It's a London Met, which they're using for pedagogy. Right, it's coming to an end. If there's any burning question or comments at this point, please shout. If not, then I will just finish it off in a minute or 2 minutes time. While you're still thinking, there is another session next week, strengthening teacher networks, decolonizing secondary school history curricula on 28th of November, and it's between 4 to 5 p.m. with Diane, Christine, and who is the report author? Diane?
Hi, it's a trio of authors actually. The lead author is a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan, and she worked with two school colleagues. So it'd be a lovely link with partnerships that universities have, because it's from obviously a teacher education perspective, and practice is a major part of teacher education. So that should be quite good.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Melissa, Jogi again, and Richard Race. Thank you very much, both of you, and everyone. Have a lovely rest of the Friday, and we'll see you on Monday, probably.